And although liberalism sometimes reaches back when it tells its own story to the 13th century, to the Magna Carta, the first great liberal thinker certainly is John Locke. John Locke is a man who personally is invested in the African slave trade. That's where he invests his own personal wealth. He's very involved in colonialism in the Americas. He writes the Constitution in 1669 for North and South Carolina. And that Constitution legitimates the dispossession of the indigenous people. It legitimates genocide, and it also legitimates the slave trade from Africa. Now, Locke's argument is that the land in the Americas is wasteland. It's uncultivated. Of course, that's totally bogus. I mean, you know, maize is not a naturally occurring crop. Maize is something that the indigenous people in the Americas developed out of a grass that was not edible. It didn't look anything like maize looks. It's through very careful breeding of plants that the mealie as we know it is developed. It's not just the mealie that we get from indigenous cultivation in the Americas. It's tequila, it's chocolate, it's the chili, you know? I mean, I personally couldn't survive without most of those things. But anyway, for Locke, it's wasteland. Therefore, people don't have a right to it. And it's very clear for Locke that the people who occupy that land are also waste. That civil society, as the idea of a space of emancipation, of debate, reason, democratic engagement, does not include those people. They're outside of it. In 1689, he writes his famous book, Two Treaties of Government, which when I was a student, in 1989, in Pietermaritzburg, I was taught as this is the beginning of the philosophy of freedom, and people are still being taught that now. But if you read that book, his politics as it relates to people outside of Europe, and let's be clear, Locke was very brutal to people inside Europe too. I mean, he thought that the children of the poor in England should go to the workhouse at the age of 3. I mean, his philosophy of freedom wasn't for dispossessed people in England. But he says the Native Americans are not joined with the rest of mankind. They don't count as fully human. Their lands are described as the vacant places of America. It's affirmed that God would not want these lands to remain common and uncultivated. He's very clear. Liberal equality could only apply to, this is the quote, creatures of the same species and rank. In other words, liberalism for Locke is not for everyone. He's actually using the language of species as well as the idea of hierarchy, of rank. Now there's a revolution in America in 1783, and Locke is taken as a key figure in that revolution. So many people who are studying politics in American universities today will be told that Locke, although he was English, is the philosophical father of America. But they taught that uncritically. But it's actually true. If America is founded on genocide and slavery, then and rights for some people only, then Locke is the philosophical father. Now that American Revolution is a demand for people in America, many of them slave owners, for rights and freedoms against the English king. It's specifically not a demand for those freedoms to be extended to indigenous people and enslaved people in America. It's not the first of the liberal revolutions. There's the Glorious Revolution in England, but it's a great liberal revolution that asserts freedom for basically property-owning white men and specifically denies freedom to everyone else. The French Revolution in 1789 is linked in some ways to the American Revolution, but in the end, it repeats the refusal to declare that the rights that are announced to hold for man, and of course that's immediately challenged by women, one of whom gets her head cut off for doing that, don't extend to Africans who are enslaved in the New World. Now the standard narrative that you would find within kind of liberal thought when there's a challenge around this evident reality that the liberal revolutions not just didn't act against slavery, but actually saw the extension of slavery, its entrenchment, would be to say, well, look, liberalism opened up a space for freedom and debate. It asserted that people could have these rights to debate, and it created a space of enlightenment that slowly spread out to include more and more people. But there's a very interesting book that's come out a few years ago, it's still quite recent, by an Italian communist thinker called Domenico Losurdo, called On Liberalism. And one of the readings I recommended for this evening is the second last chapter from that book. Now, he argues that in the Netherlands, in England, the United States, and I'm reading from him, is that all of these revolutions meant that the demand for liberty and the justification of the enslavement as well as the decimation or destruction of, obviously in inverted commas, barbarians were closely entwined. Slavery is not something that persisted despite the success of the three liberal revolutions. On the contrary, it experienced its maximum development following that success. So that's just an empirical fact. We can debate liberalism, but we can't debate that historical fact. It's quite clear. So for Losurdo, liberal thought from the beginning orbits around a distinction between sacred spaces, England, and profane spaces, or same